Okay. And then, okay. Okay. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you. Very happy to see especially Hervé, Bernard, and Chital. So this conference will last, I think, for about 2 hours, but Hervé will have to leave before the end. And so we will begin with Hervé as the first speaker. So Hervé Snijwijs is a research director at the CNRS, Centre National de Recherche Scientifique in French, the president of the INSERM Ethics Committee for Medical Research and Health, also a French organization. He's also research director of the Glial Plasticity and Brain Tumors Research Team, director of the Paris Seine Neuroscience Laboratory at the new Paris Seine and Institute of Biology, and many other things, but especially concerning ethical questions. So, Hervé, the floor is yours. Do you want to share PowerPoint, or you want to speak like you want?
No, I will make a brief introduction to our discussion, and yes, I deeply apologize that I will have to leave before 6, before of the loss of a very close friend and the visits to the family I have to do. So we are speaking tonight of the Oviedo Convention, and just to remember to all of you, to remind to all of you the fact that this is the only binding instrument that exists today, even if only 28 countries at that time ratified this convention. It's important also to recall that the convention was the final writing was in 1997, but the discussion started as soon as 1991. And for the interest of the discussion tonight, obviously we are going to focus on Article 13, which is the article mentioning interventions on the human genome. And to be precise, this article says an intervention seeking to modify the human genome may only be undertaken for preventive, diagnostic, or therapeutic purposes, and only if its aim is not to introduce any modification in the genome of any descendant. So this article needs to be understood and to see from where it's coming. First, this article don't prevent any kind of research, because fundamental research is not concerned by this article. This article just forbid any intervention that should modify the genome of future generation and try to limit the modification of human genome to preventive, diagnostic, or therapeutic purposes, but more or less any kind of fundamental research in life science could be qualified preventive, diagnostic, or therapeutic purposes. Something very interesting is that as soon as the discussion started, the working parties in the end of 92 for Article 13, and you can find on the website of the convention all or a summary of the elements of the discussion. Something that was very interesting at that time was that already the working parties wished the intervention on the human genome to be limited to cases necessary for the protection of health. And this question of how we consider health and non-health application is something essential to recall from the very beginning of the discussion. It was hoped that this would avoid non-therapeutic interventions. And it was important for them that such intervention should be only made on somatic cells and not on germ cells. And this discussion between somatic cells and germ cells was already a long-term discussion in the working parties to elaborate the convention. Some experts felt that we should not take the risk to create human beings who were genetically different from one generation to the next. So at this point, everybody should remember that the nature is making some changes from one generation to the other between the chromosomes of our parents and our chromosome. We have rearrangement, but we have also an average of 40 modifications among the 3 billion base pair of our genome. But the idea was that at that time, considering the present stage of scientific knowledge, it was needed to prohibit such intervention on germ cell line, considering the unpredictability of their effect on subsequent generations. It was further pointed out that, once again, at the present time, when defective genes are manipulated, it could not be certain that only these genes and their functions are affected by the manipulation. I mention this point because more or less it's exactly the same discussions we have with genome editing today, or we had for the last few years. Very interestingly, if you get back to the discussions, you always had two kinds of experts. Some experts very hostile to any kind of opening, and some other participants that consider that nevertheless we should left open the possibility to make this intervention, and that it might be possible to authorize germ cell therapy, although the intervention will need to carry a certain number of guarantees which were not available at the present stage of scientific knowledge, but within the advancement of science could appear. If, on the other hand, such therapy proved its worth and reliability, those experts might be able to accept it under certain conditions. Once again, it's exactly the same kind of discussions on genome editing today. What kind of science we have? Do we need to close the door forever, or could it be possible to open it in certain conditions? So as soon as that time, it's very interesting also to see that the working parties discuss the possibility for exceptions and discuss what kind of exceptions could be anticipated, what kind of progress in the medical field or in the scientific field could allow. And as soon as in these early 90s, the prospect of eliminating the genes which cause diabetes, which cause Huntington chorea, which cause hemophilia, were already thought as ethically acceptable. So the main point, and this was a point of agreement for all experts, was that no interference with the germ cell line should be permitted for the purpose of perfecting human existence, rendering human beings more intelligent, musical, athletic, etc. So this was the red line. Okay to consider, else no for any other kind of interference. And very interestingly, this is exactly what were the discussion when we consider the WHO group on human genome editing now starting beginning of 2019, it was clear, and it was the first declaration of our group that, and it was the declaration of Tedros, the Director General of WHO, that at this time it would be irresponsible considering the status of knowledge and the status of science to make any kind of genome editing on human embryos or on human germlines because of the uncertainties. But it's clear that this, at this time, could change if one, progress in scientific knowledge, and there is no ethical consideration out of ground on scientific knowledge. Two, clear application in the medical field, and this application should be some default of the PGD, because we have other ways now to prevent genetic disease, genetic disorders. So what kind of default should have to be considered? And three, a societal deliberation that would observe the scientific progress, consider the medical application, and finally decide to apply or not these genetic modifications. So it's very interesting to make a parallel between what was said at the time and what was said more recently. And if you consider, for example, our recommendations to WHO, the first recommendation is to WHO itself and its Director General. And it states that we recommend WHO to be open about the opportunities and challenges inherent in human genome editing. So an open view and possibilities, clearly stating the ethical aspect of human genome editing. This will require statements on both somatic and heritable human genome editing. So you see, we didn't close the door to nothing. And we just recommend a clear and regular review, considering several ethical and values and principles, and I will conclude this introduction on this. We need to have clear elements on to inform how decisions are made, and we recommended openness, transparency, honesty, and accountability. This is the European Code of Conduct. Responsible regulatory stewardship, to know clearly what is allowed and not allowed. Responsible stewardship of science, responsible stewardship of research resource. And we also need to inform what decisions are made. And in these views, and particularly now considering the cost of the treatment and the difficulty of access, we need to consider inclusiveness, we need to consider caution, we need fairness, social justice, non-discrimination, equal moral worth, respect for persons, solidarity, and global health justice. So, in my view, there is a continuing discussion from Oviedo to today, from the conventions to the WHO recommendations, that always take into consideration the state of the scientific knowledge and the state of our ignorance, the state of the interest of peoples and the state of our uncertainties, and to consider evolutive reviews to know what kind of intervention should be ethical, meaning in the benefit of human beings. Thank you so much for giving me the possibility to make this introduction.
Thank you, Hervé. That was really very clear. So, especially because you had not much time to prepare, but really it was Great. I have quite a few questions, but I will maybe ask first the participants and to ask questions if they want, and of course, especially Bernard. Bernard and Chital. So it's always difficult to be the first one to ask a question, but please try. Nobody? Or
can I maybe ask?
Boris, yes.
Okay,
Yes, Dimitri, go ahead.
Yeah, I will start maybe Dimitri first because I'm in the car. I'm out in a minute.
Just as to understand, so basically the permanent gene modification is forbidden. But for example, if you have transient gene modification, which will be transferred to permanent physical modification, like for example, you play with muscle growth and you have transient alteration of muscle related genes, then you will have physiological change in muscles. You become stronger, faster, whatever you play with. So then this gene modification will not go to the next generation, so it's perfectly allowed, right?
Yes, in the Oviedo Convention, only the interventions that should modify the genome of future generation are forbidden. The other modifications are allowed if they are in the field of preventive, diagnostic, or therapeutic purposes.
But this law applies only to the territory of United States and European Union. For example, if somebody goes to, I don't know, Iran, Ukraine, whatever, and do there, these countries are not in these treaties, or they also sign the treaties.
So the Oviedo Convention is a binding treaty, and considering the binding treaty, it was only ratified by 28 countries, mainly European countries. The US didn't ratify the Oviedo. Now you have to consider why certain countries didn't ratify. Certain countries like Germany or Poland consider it was too light, too open, because their history or their traditional religious background needed more stringent laws. But basically, Germany or Poland, for example, would apply the non-modification of the genome of future generation. Other countries considered Oviedo as too stringent, for example, UK or Sweden. These two countries consider that it could be possible to modify the genome of future generation for certain very specific reasons. And you know most likely that already 3 years ago, UK decided to allow mitochondrial transfer, and mitochondrial transfer is the genetic modification of a group of 37 genes, because the mitochondrial genome contains 37 genes. So changing mitochondria from one person to a donor is going to change the genome of future generation. But it was considered that this kind of change could be acceptable to treat these mitochondrial diseases that are incompatible with prolonged life. So Oviedo is taken into consideration also in these countries and in some aspect of their laws, but they didn't ratify it as the binding treaty.
And the second is where there are grants and how this is actually enforced. For example, if some startup develop a treatment like using the viral vector, and this viral vector just change some grown-up body, so not on the embryo level, but there is a small risk that will also some changes will happen in sperm cells, for example. So how actually it's controlled? I mean, if there is risk, it's completely no-go, or it's somehow how? So what's the legal procedure here?
It's interesting, your question, because it was the matter of lengthy discussion during the 90s. And on one side, you had already the discussion on gene therapy and the question that any kind of gene therapy, because of using viral vector, as you say, could finish at the level of testis or ovaries and modify the germ cells on a way unintended, but that could happen. And a parallel at that time was done with people receiving chemotherapy in the framework of cancer. And we know that a certain number of this chemotherapy could lead to some mutations in germ cells. So the idea was to consider research and trying to increase the knowledge about gene therapy, the same way as we try to increase the knowledge on the secondary effect or undesired effect of chemotherapies, but not to prevent this kind of treatment in the framework of health and the balance of benefit risk for the patient.
Okay. Boris, you had one question, but I don't know if you can ask it now. Otherwise, I have one question. I'm not sure.
You can go ahead first.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe, yeah, actually, that's kind of a central question, at least to me. So you said that at one moment that the consensus was about not how did you say that? Not perfecting, you use the word, not perfecting humans, but only working on health. But you know the definition of health by the WHO, the Constitution of 1948. It's health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So is health in the conception of Oviedo, of the people who ratified, the people and organizations and states who ratified the Convention of Oviedo, is held then kind of not answering this definition. So because if you are perfecting human, you can improve health.
It's a constant discussion, and it's something that came also for genome editing, and this was also the reason why at a given stage of the discussion, at the very beginning, Oviedo was focused, and the article 13 was focused only on therapeutic application. And then, because of the arguments you are raising, appeared diagnosis and preventive, because it was also a long discussion on vaccines. Vaccines are used clearly to prevent a disease and not to treat a disease. And there is a dimension of prevention that need to be considered. Now, all this is around the fact that you have a clear definition of the existence of a disease. A vaccine is to prevent the contamination by a virus or by a bacteria. And some interventions are to prevent a clearly identified disease that is going to make lesions to the tissue. So in each case, whether it's preventive or curative, you are dealing with a disease. The facts to have more or less muscle in the normal range, the facts to be more beautiful or less beautiful, and this need to be considered what means being more or less beautiful. The facts to be more or less smart, excluded once again some clear disease like neurodegenerative disease, is something which is out of the definition of disease. And all these working parties and all these discussions wanted to remain in the framework of health, in the meaning of considering an identified disease, trying to prevent, diagnose, or treat this identified disease, and remove outside as non-health, and perfection of human existence, every other aspect that were not relevant to human, to an identified human disease.
Okay. And probably, of course, I would say not considering aging as a disease. Because this was
once again, this is a discussion, and in some case it's an open discussion. I remember being a young resident in neurology, and at that time we were wondering if neurodegenerative disorders such as Parkinson, in my case Parkinson, it could be a discussion also on Alzheimer, is a form of accelerated aging of the brain, or a really identified disease. Because you know that in most postmortem dissections of the brain, you can find senile plaques and you can find some stigmat of Alzheimer's disease. So now it's more and more considered as a disease because of the aggregation of synuclein in Parkinson, because of the aggregation of presenilin in Alzheimer. But you still find discussions where the question of aging and the question of the active mechanisms of aging, such as apoptosis, for example, for the death of cells, are considered or not as a disease.
Thank you very much. So the last question will be, no, the two last questions, Boris and Mark, because I see that you have your hand and I didn't notice it before. So Boris and then Mark, and then after that the word will be to Chital.
Okay. Yeah. Hi everyone. So I'm Boris, and I'm doing. So I'm having a startup in biotech to do the transient reprogramming. So it is basically not a modification of the DNA itself. It is modification of the DNA expression. So we would introduce, at least we would activate some genes, or we would introduce that different ways. You have the Crispr, you have the viral vectors, you have the mRNA, but we would introduce the genes to reprogram a cell to turn the DNA methylation clock back. So our idea is to really fast track that, because it is at least in the research, it is one of the highest potential sort of treatment, which could basically reverse a lot of risk disease for the autoimmune disease, the cardiovascular, the degenerative diseases, and so it is. I would say, like, on the ethical side, it is something which has a potential to save millions of people, and like on another side, it is still linked to the. At least you would introduce some genes. Ideally, it would be episomal, so not in the nucleus itself, so it could be hereditary. Now, what do you think, like this kind of, what would be the obstacles to bring such a product to the market to benefit the patients? What would be the obstacles to introduce such a product, in your opinion?
Well, if you are not modifying permanently the genome, It's not covered by Article 13 of Oviedo, and the fundamental questions are efficiency of the method, safety of the method, and short and long-term survey of this safety of the method. So at that time, what is really in the scope of Oviedo at the time of Oviedo or today with genome editing is the permanent modification, the chemical, the structural permanent modification of the genome. But Oviedo is not dealing with the gene expression. We are permanently modifying our gene expression by the way we are exposing our skin to the sun, by the way we are eating some food, by the way we are treating ourselves with or without exercise, and so on and so forth. So you are not able to cover any kind of modification of gene expression. What is covered by Oviedo is the permanent modification of the structure of DNA transmissible to future generations.
Thank you.
Okay.
And now the last question. The last question is for Marc.
Thank you, Didier, and very happy to see you, Hervé. It's quite a long time. Yes, as you know, but maybe not everybody here, I'm a representative of the transhumanism movement in France. And so my main question on this topic is exactly what you was pointing. That means the fact that Oviedo prohibits the possibility to modify the modification on genome for diverse generations. My question maybe could be, what's your own and personal opinion on this? Putting on one side the fact that okay, for now we have technical impossibilities, and so I think on this part everybody agree except one Chinese maybe 3 years ago, but even transhumanists won't agree on the idea to modify the genome if with this state of the art. So we don't know enough for the long-term consequences. But on the other part, we have the ethical questions, and that is our point. Quickly, I say two things. First of all, it's a question. If we're thinking that in some, I don't know, years, maybe decades, we will be able technically to manage the possibilities of modification and understand much more what could be the consequences in the long term. Can we say that at the same time we will be able to reverse the changing? So in this case, it will be possible to make some changes for one person, but this modification may be stopped at the first generation. I don't know if I'm clear, but I think that the two things can arrive at the same time. So maybe that the problem won't be the same. We won't have to fear the fact to not control what will happen on several generations. And the second and last question, I will set it in general, is, well, if there's so much differences between such kinds of modification, genetic modifications, and what we are already doing from centuries by education. I mean, what is the real difference in terms of determination? Because, well, I think that I understand that for a lot of people, what is unacceptable is the idea that with this kind of modification, we will determine at a high level the life of the other peoples. But I really wonder if the difference with education is so important. This is probably 2-3 different questions, but well, I wanted to try to cover before you leave. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. We could spend days and days to try to discuss, not to answer, but to discuss these questions. Clearly, there is I don't know if it's exactly the genetic determinism which is taken into consideration with this genetic modification, because I think that most of the people that are involved are not considering any kind of genetic determinism, but more the uncertainties. And it's clear that there is no genetic determinism, excepted in a few cases such as Huntington disease, but it's very rare. Most of the case, you have a lot of modification of gene expression. And the main question is that we don't know. We are ignorant, and we don't know most of the consequences of what we are doing. It's clear now that we are going for identified disease to play the game, because the balance benefit-risk is clear to evaluate. This will be the case for cancer with the CAR-T, and genome editing is used for CAR-T, but this is in somatic cells, this is transient. It will be the case certainly for hemoglobinopathy, drepanocytosis and beta thalassemia in the coming months or few years. And then will come most likely later some other, because for in vivo treatments, for example, in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, because of in vivo treatment, you are not controlling exactly what you are doing, especially with the vectors. And so it's the next step. And the next step is more uncertainty than determinism. Is because we don't know what is going to happen, we need to be cautious. Then I think that there is really a difference between modifying gene and education, because education is so multifactorial. You are not educated by one person. You are educated by a great diversity of persons. And because if you are lucky enough, you have two parents, and the two parents, your two parents are loving you the same way, but always, all the time, they have two different views on the world. And you grow up because of these differences, and you have a chance to make yourself an individual because of these interactions with grown-ups that have different views and share with you with these different views. You cannot do that with genetics. So genetics is really different from education. But we should need to speak for hours to have your counter-arguments and to hear mine.
Okay, and this will be for another time. So thank you very much, Hervé. Now, Sonny will speak. She's a senior lecturer in the field of bioethics, international law, and intellectual property law. She holds degrees and is admitted attorney at the High Court of South Africa. Her research interests are genomic and the ethics of reproduction. She is currently assisting with the drafting of clinical guidelines for the provision of genetic services and serves on an expert panel of the network of African Academies of Science and Academy of Science of South Africa. So, Gital, the floor is yours, and you can normally share the screen by just pushing on the green button on the screen below.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I am going to share my screen. Just let me know when you can view it.
You have a message saying it's beginning. Yes. Yes, we can, not full screen, but for the rest it's perfect.
Sure, I will fix that now.
Perfect.
All right, thank you very much. I will just preface this talk by just reiterating that I am a law academic, so my expertise, even though my research interests are on genomics, ethics of reproduction, some fertility law, and technology law, it really is limited to the law and ethical issues around this. So when it comes to the science, I am guided by the literature that is available out there. So I will not address those issues, but rather I'll just consider the legal and a little bit of the ethical position. So I'm going to discuss, the broad topic is CRISPR, longevity, and the right to health. So just to consider, I apologize, I'm trying to change my screen.
I have sometimes this problem. Sometimes you have just, to put the R.
There we go. All right, it just is a little bit slow. All right, so Hervé has given such a good background on the Oviedo Convention, background to the discussions leading to Oviedo. So I'm going to try and limit my discussion of Oviedo, apart from just reiterate a few important points that he did mention. The first being that it's the first international legally binding instrument in the field, and it's designed really to protect human rights and dignity with regards to technological developments, biotechnology developments. So it contains provisions that really guide us regarding law and ethics in relation to medical acts and medical interventions. And so the principles will be applicable to new biomedical technologies. Now, Oviedo, as an international law, it has the same underlying problem that we find in law generally, in that when we look at law and scientific development, we find that the law develops far slower than the scientific development. We find that scientific development, it moves quite quickly, and law takes quite a long time to draft. It takes a long time to be discussed and deliberated, to be refined, and then finally to be formalized in writing. So law is always lagging behind developing science. So the difficulty we find today is looking at the instruments that we have, whether it's national laws or whether it's international law, and looking at what the state of scientific development is, and asking ourselves, how can we interpret, how can we apply the law we have to the scientific developments? Does it apply? Do we need new laws, or is our current law restrictive? Is it going to prohibit these developments generally? So Oviedo links to a number of different other instruments, although it's important because, like Hervé mentioned, it's got a specific article that speaks to genetic interventions like CRISPR, like gene editing. So it's a framework convention. The idea behind international laws is that the states that become party to these laws will draw the principles, the guidance from the laws, and create laws with these principles in their own countries. So that's why we call it a framework convention. And Oviedo itself says that the principles can be developed further by additional protocols to the convention being created. And there are additional protocols to Oviedo. So it creates these standards, and the states that are party to Oviedo have to take legal measures to ensure enforcement, to ensure that the principles that we see in Oviedo appear in their own legal systems. So can we ask, is Oviedo harmful to collective health? And when I read Oviedo, we're asked here to consider Oviedo and the Constitution of the World Health Organization. And when we compare those two documents, I'll put up the WHO document just now, but when we look at the way that the words appear, and in law, remember, in law, that is a critical aspect for us, what words are used, how the sentences are constructed, because it's from the wording that we derive what the law is. It's what we understand the rights that the instrument is speaking about. And when we read Oviedo, Oviedo very quickly says that it wants to protect individual rights. It wants to ensure human dignity of the individual. It wants to make sure that the individual's rights are not superseded or triumphed by the rights of society in general. Now, when we look at the WHO document, you'll see that the World Health Organization, as a structure, has set out to guide nations as to what minimum standards of care should be in relation to health. So the World Health Organization takes a bit of a different approach in that the World Health Organization wants to say to states, well, countries, this is what you need to do for your citizens. This is how you enforce and realize the right to health. This is the type of healthcare services you should offer to people in the country. So there's that little bit of conflict between the way Oviedo and the Constitution of the World Health Organization is written. But Oviedo in itself, I would say that it's not harmful to collective health, because in general, we find that laws are often written from the perspective of protecting a person's rights. For instance, I'll talk a little bit later about the South African Constitution, because naturally that's the national law I'm most familiar with. But the Bill of Rights in South African law, like the Bill of Rights in most countries, it speaks about protecting a person's rights, a person's right to health, a person's right to be protected from certain things, etc. Now, Oviedo does have legal enforceability as an international law, but like Hervé said, it's got quite a limited application if we look at who is legally bound by Oviedo, or if we ask it a different way, how much does Oviedo actually matter to the world at large? And, this isn't a problem with Oviedo. This is a problem with international law. It's a fundamental difference between international law and national law. We find that national law applies uniformly to everybody within a country. International law, we would think to understand it as law that applies internationally, but that's not actually the case. International law works on the principle of consent, meaning only states who have ratified the law will actually be bound by that law. And like Hervé mentioned, it's only about 29 countries that have ratified, so they are legally obligated to make sure that the principles are reflected in their law and that they follow the principles of Oviedo. The other countries, they could choose not to consider Oviedo at all, but for the most part, Oviedo is important because it is that one place in international law where we find genetic technology is directly being spoken to. So it is important, especially in this particular time and the development in science that we're seeing. So again, why Oviedo is, it does actually consider collective health is, if we look at the preamble to Oviedo, and this is the very first few words of the law, it says that the convention does require consideration of other international laws. Oviedo says we should look at other European conventions, for instance. So it does cross-reference a lot of other things. It's not restrictive in that sense. And then it says specifically that the drafters were convinced of the need to respect the human being both as an individual and as a member of the human species, and recognizing the importance of ensuring dignity of the human being. So again, it does reflect a collective interest here. So Article 27 as well says that nothing prevents wider protection. And what that means is that Oviedo will not prevent a state, a country from deciding to create more legal protection in relation to what it's saying. So there's other words we see in Oviedo that speaks to collective interests. We see the words present and future generations, for instance, being referred to. We see members of society being referred to. So Oviedo does consider the interests of a broader group as such as well. If we look at the technology that is in question, CRISPR technology, gene editing technology, particularly in relation to enhancement. Let's look at what Oviedo says. And again, Article 13 has been referred to. Article 13 speaks to interventions on the human genome. It says that interventions seeking to modify the human genome may only be undertaken for preventative, diagnostic, or therapeutic purposes, and only if the aim is not to introduce modification in the genome of any descendants. Now, the one thing I want to say about Article 13 and Oviedo in general is that it predates CRISPR technology in the sense that CRISPR technology now, its wider application is only now being really debated. What can we use the technology for? Shall we consider uses beyond therapeutic benefits? Shall we consider enhancements? What are we willing to allow the technology to be used for? So again, Article 13 doesn't use the word gene editing. It doesn't use the word CRISPR or clustered regularly interspaced palindromic repeats. It doesn't have the words relating to the technology, but it just talks about interventions. So the wording, it suggests that CRISPR technology would be permitted if the use is therapeutic. Like Hervé said, the wording of Article 13, it says preventative, diagnostic, or therapeutic. And then it goes on to say, only if its aim is not to introduce modification in the genome of descendants. And if we think of CRISPR technology, I think one of the primary and fundamental debates with CRISPR technology is that distinction between somatic uses, somatic gene editing, and heritable gene editing, and which would be permitted and when would we be prepared to permit and allow heritable genome editing. Article 13 of Oviedo clearly says, the technology, the intervention must not introduce a modification in descendants, which means it would speak against heritable edits. It would prohibit heritable gene editing. So if we consider enhancements, an enhancement I would interpret as the use of the technology to derive a benefit or for a purpose that is non-therapeutic, a non-medical benefit. And here again, it seems that Article 13 is placing a ban on that because it clearly says preventative, diagnostic, or therapeutic purposes. In law. So the effect on collective health if we can consider that. Article 13 is really looking at protecting the right to health.
Is there a problem with the connection only with me or with everybody?
Yes, I don't hear anything.
I have the same issue. The sound is cutting quite
Okay, I'm afraid. Wait. I'm afraid that the connection.
Sheetal is down. Apparently, she's.
Yeah, Sheetal is stopped.
Anymore.
So maybe it was quite interesting. But I propose Bernard, if it is okay for you, to begin your intervention.
Sheetal is coming back.
Okay. Okay.
I apologize.
Yeah, technical problems.
Yes, it's the internet connection. Can I continue?
Yes, sure. We saw you disappearing. Okay, but yeah, take the slide. We will say if it was okay at this time.
Sure.
Okay.
Was this the slide that was up?
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
All right. So, yeah. So, I was speaking. I'm so sorry. I noticed when I was quite advanced in the discussion that the Zoom controls disappeared. So what I was saying about Article 13 is that it seems to rule out any non-medical application of the technology and, therefore any enhancement uses. All right. Now, if we consider the WHO Constitution, which was also the other document which the conference related to. Here we see, in the preamble to the Constitution of the World Health Organization, a number of important points. The one, I heard it being spoken a short while ago was that if we think about what health is interpreted as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So that sort of goes, we can, compare to what Oviedo just said, because Oviedo is looking at, technology is being used only for therapeutic benefits, medical bases, not for enhancement purposes. If we look at the WHO Constitution, we see that ambit to interpret what would be in the interest of health, it's far broader, because it's saying that health is not only about whether you are free of disease or not. Health is looking at your complete, a 360-degree view of your well-being. So it's a much broader interpretation. And again, if we go through that preamble, it speaks to the duty of governments to really take responsibility for health and to ensure that they have resources to provide for that. Now, I wanted to consider specifically longevity and the right to health. And I think a primary and fundamental question we must consider is, what does longevity actually mean? Because it's not simply, we can basically say that longevity is looking at prolonging life or extending lifespan, but there may be a number of different reasons for that. we can ask, does it mean prolonging life in the absence of disease, which would mean people extending their natural lifespan, which would be a benefit, that I think few would argue against? Or alternatively, does it mean prolonging life where disease can result in a shorter life expectancy? And I think from a law perspective, from the perspective of the law, it's that latter meaning that the law has and is constantly considering in relation to the right to health. Because when we look at the provision of healthcare, for instance, in countries, when we find that patients are ill and they have difficulty accessing healthcare services, difficulty receiving treatment, medication, etc., they can legally argue that their right to health is being infringed. And when these cases come before a court, it's often argued that their right to health is being infringed because what is happening to them is actually creating a situation where they are going to have a shorter life expectancy. They're not going to live as long because they cannot access the health care that's going to allow that. And, if time permits, I'm going to just take you through one of the very important South African cases where the court considered longevity in itself. So if we look at those two documents again, if we look at Oviedo, if we look at the Constitution of WHO, it indicates that we would undoubtedly support longevity. I apologize, my slide is a little bit incorrect. The latter would be supported undoubtedly, prolonging life where there's a therapeutic benefit to that, where it's for therapeutic reasons because that patient has some kind of illness or disabling condition that may result in a shorter life expectancy. The documents would support a therapeutic intervention that would prolong their life. But in the absence of disease, should we and can we intervene using technology to prolong our lifespans? I would be hesitant to say no, because just now talk about law being progressive. We can't constantly be thinking about interpreting law the same way for decades. Law must be progressive. We must think of things as they apply in today's context, as they apply relating to new technologies that didn't exist when Oviedo was written or when the WHO Constitution was written. But prolonging life where there's an absence of disease, it very much, requires that reflection that we're making now in relation to human genome editing that is heritable human genome editing. There's a lot of questions we have to ask. There's a lot of things we have to consider before we proceed to say, yes, let's do this. So for instance, we have to ask, what would the effect of that intervention be? Because remember, we're prolonging life in the absence of disease. On a large scale, what would the practical effect be? Could it, for instance, result in a strain of resources? Another question would be, is it a bad thing? Can we argue against prolonging life? Why wouldn't or why shouldn't we want to do this? We live in a completely different world now where we've got the benefit of technology, the benefit of science and medicine. A lot of progress has been made. Why wouldn't we want to live longer? I think when it comes to genetic interventions, one factor that does pose an obstacle is our memory. Because when we think back on the history of genetic research around the world, the one word that inevitably emerges is eugenics. And we think back on genetic research that was conducted around the world, unethical research. South Africa has its own history with unethical genetic research during the apartheid era. So inevitably we cast our minds back, and even though we need to reflect on the past, again, that should not necessarily prevent us from moving forward. It simply means we must be cautious. So we must be cautious regarding extending the use beyond therapeutics. and because we can consider other interventions. With longevity, we do prolong lifespans. Doctors do this every day when they treat their patients. But inevitably, with scientific development, once one use is identified, we ask, what else can we do? And we see this with other interventions like genetic screening. Genetic screening, it was designed to identify and screen against genetic disease. And the question of enhancement also arose there. The question of whether we could, for instance, use it to select the sex of embryos, where there was no medical basis for that selection, arose there. Today, we have genetic screening called, or rather, the use of polygenic risk scoring. Embryos are scored based on a variety of different genetic traits, and that is beginning to be considered as an add-on to fertility treatment. So the possibilities really become endless. And I think it's a question of how we proceed, because the difficulty with law is, as soon as you quickly prohibit something, you're going to find a patient who's going to travel to that country that offers the service legally. They're going to get their treatment and they're going to come back home. And we've seen it around the world in the context of plastic surgery. We've seen it in the context of fertility treatment, and inevitably it will happen with gene editing. Countries that very strictly regulate the uses of gene therapies, for instance, patients who can afford to travel, they're going to travel to get their healthcare. So it's a very difficult question, how the law can be used. But looking at the law, that's where I'll move towards ending my presentation. The law is designed to protect individual and collective rights, because remember, the rights are often framed as individual rights, but they work together to create a society that we feel is ethically or morally acceptable. And I think in the context of longevity, it's not only the right to health that is important, but the right to life, and what the right to life actually means, because in South Africa, we've interpreted that right on several occasions. We've interpreted in the context of, for instance, abortions, termination of pregnancy. We have interpreted in the context how it relates to the right to health. This is a fundamental right. We find it in most constitutions around the world. We find it in the Bill of Rights in different countries, but it's not absolute. Inevitably, the wording of the law, where we find this right, it's usually the same. Everyone has the right to life. No one should be deprived of the right to life. But it's not absolute, because we can think of certain circumstances where a person's right to life is violated. For instance, where they lose their life. For instance, in self-defense. In the context of defending yourself, you may seriously injure or even injure someone to the extent that they die. Some countries impose the death penalty for very serious crimes. It's not many, but there are some countries and some states in the United States that do this. And again, it's on their interpretation of the right to life, and whether in certain circumstances you can choose to prioritize other rights or other people's rights instead. So we have to contextualize the rights. Now, why I wanted to talk about life in relation to longevity is because in South Africa, we considered this right, the right to life, as it relates to the right to health, and we considered it in relation to how long a person lives, how long a patient lives. So I think it was quite appropriate when we consider longevity. And here the case was a 1997 case, but it's a very fundamental case in our law. And we often find that when we look at medical cases, our courts often come back to this case and look at what the court was saying here. And the case is called Subramani, that was the patient's name, versus the Minister of Health, because he sued the Minister of Health. And very, very briefly, this was a patient who was in chronic renal failure, and he was not a candidate for a transplant, for an organ transplant. He required dialysis several times a week, and he found himself in a situation where he could not receive dialysis treatment because the hospitals did not have enough dialysis machines. And what the hospital told him is that they've got such a long patient list of patients who require dialysis treatment that they have to prioritize the patients who receive the care. And so they look at certain factors that are going to exclude patients or put them further down the list. And when they looked at this patient, they said, look, you are in chronic renal failure, yes, but you're not a candidate for a transplant. And there are other patients here who are. And therefore, when they assess the patients, in essence, they prioritize other patients ahead of him. So he sued the Minister of Health and he said, well, I've been deprived of access to dialysis. The effect is that I'm not being treated and I'm going to have a shorter life expectancy. And so he argued his right to life was violated. Now, this case went all the way to our constitutional court, and the court said, yes, the state is expected to take steps to realize the right to health and the right to life, but practical limitation in resources had to be considered. In South Africa, we have a massive issue with limitation of resources in public healthcare systems. There's a lot of healthcare that is limited to certain parts of the country if we're looking at the public healthcare system. So it is quite difficult for certain patients who access public healthcare to get certain types of treatments. Dialysis was one of them here. So the court said if we look at dialysis, a shortage of machines meant that the patient's care had to be prioritized, other patients. And unfortunately, this patient did fall down the list. And specifically, what is significant that the court said is that although the right to life means that no one should be arbitrarily deprived of their life, it does not mean the right to live forever, which was quite an interesting thing for the court to say, that the right to life does not mean that you have the right to live forever. So in the context of longevity, that's quite an interesting kind of thing. But again, this is a case from 1997, where we didn't have interventions that we have available now, where we can look at prolonging life even longer, you know. This patient himself, potentially there are technologies now to treat a lot of conditions that we find patients with today if they were made available on an equitable basis, if we had access. So in countries where we don't have a limitation of resources, there are definitely fewer obstacles to protecting the right to health and the right to life. It is a struggle for some countries. So when we're thinking about longevity, when we're thinking about technologies like CRISPR, inevitably it's going to be, you know, there's going to be this issue, and we find this debate in the gene editing, you know, discussion, this debate about equity and access, because inevitably we're going to find that a lot of countries will sort of be excluded from embracing the technology, really, because they don't have those resources. And, you know, so we're going to find when we look at interventions that remove, for instance, disease, we're going to eventually create a situation where unless we find some way of increasing access, we're going to find disease start to fall onto the fringes of society, for instance, below the poverty line. We're going to find certain nations to be deemed unhealthy, really, because they don't have the technology to remove the diseases from their population, etc. So just to conclude, if we look at these two documents that I was asked to look at today, we look at Oviedo and the WHO Constitution, they're both incredibly valuable because they are instruments of norms and standards. And neither of them have the force of law, except for Oviedo, for those nations that ratified it. But the rest of the world can use them as a guideline because they show us what the standards can be. And they may not necessarily support non-therapeutic extension of life, but that's not to say that it will never ever be permitted It simply means we need societal reflection, because we must think about law, and we find, for instance, I can give you an example off the top of my head. In South Africa, surrogacy, where a woman carries a child on behalf of another woman or another couple, it was never permitted in law until, just about a decade ago, really because society's senses of value and morality and ethics, it changed to sort of accommodate that this is a way that people can create families, and the law evolved to embrace that concept. So it's not to say that we may not find legal permissions in future. It simply means we need those conversations now so that we can move, because like I said, the law moves very slowly, but we need to be thinking about where we stand as society. So law must evolve, and Oviedo, the WHO Constitution, national laws, they must all be interpreted in light of the developments we see today. A lot of people are quick to say Oviedo does not mean anything to anyone except those 29 countries. A lot of people say Oviedo doesn't mention Crispr, so it doesn't apply, and that's not true. That's not true, because in law, as in other disciplines, we think very hard about the words, we think very hard about the issues, and they actually do speak to the issues if you really think about it. So the technological developments can inform new laws, and those laws may not necessarily be restrictive or prohibitive. It may be initially, but once we have that engagement and debate, we may find a basis to permit these uses. So to conclude, what I would like to say is that from a legal perspective, we must consider these things in a progressive light, in a way that we address and acknowledge technological development, we embrace the potential, but we must also not neglect the protection of rights. Thank you very much. That's where I would like to end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheetal. It was quite interesting, also quite clear, and so I have a few questions, and also a few comments, but I will first give the floor to the people who want. You can directly speak, or you can raise your hand like you prefer, if there is somebody wanting, and don't forget to unmute yourself, of course, otherwise we cannot hear you. Voice or no? Nobody? 1, 2, 3.
Yes.
Okay. Go.
Question,
yeah.
I have always a question. Sheetal, thank you very much for this very interesting intervention. Well, I had a few questions, but for much of them you answer yourself during your speech. So thank you very much. But you're saying that it's now important to have societal reflection if we want, or if it could be possible to go further from the actual situation. I want again to ask you, if you want to answer, what is your personal opinion about the question you was asking? What will be the effects? Can you imagine positive ones, positive effects, for example, about extending lifespan? You were saying at moments in one of your slides that, okay, maybe it could be possible and interesting, but we have to ask what will the effect. I think that if we are not able to think about positive, and if we are only thinking about bad effects, we will have bad effects at the moment. What do you think about that? Can you imagine positive effects?
Thank you very much. That's such a great question, and I agree with you completely. I think I think as a cautionary approach, it's natural to consider what is the worst things that could happen. What do we want to guard against? But like you're saying, that may prevent us from actually moving forward if we don't look at what the positives could be. So I think it really is a balancing act, because in law, that is what we do. It's always a balancing act, because we look at what the law says, and if there's any way to, if there's any situation where we're considering something that law does not apply to, or that law is prohibiting, we have to look at a way that we can balance rights or balance interests or interpret in a different way. So when I consider the benefits of prolonging life, so like I said, we would think, well, what are the effects? And immediately we'll think, well, what is the practical effect of allowing or rather creating a situation where we have prolonged lifespans? And one of them would be, would it result in the escalation or, an escalation in population number that is beyond sustainability? I think that's one very practical effect that weighs against the argument. But if we look at the benefits, I think it could promote further development of society in a manner that isn't possible currently. If we think of prolonged lifespans, it would benefit society, because if we think of all the progress that is being made currently, and again, I'm not considering the negatives, if we think of progress being made, that could go, unhindered. I wouldn't say indefinitely, but almost continuously I'm not even sure how to describe it, in that development of society. And for instance, if we think about science and technology, we would have that further development that would occur much slower, I think, than it would without an intervention that prolongs lifespan. I think prolonging lifespans would result in a continuous progression and movement forward that we see happen at a slower pace now, simply because we know what the normal life expectancy is, and we know that the older people get, their risk of developing conditions that may affect, for instance, the way that they work or their capacity to think, may be impeded. Prolonging life, provided it came with maintaining our faculties and things like that, I think it would ultimately benefit society, because again, we would be able to do what we're doing, and assuming that's positive, for a longer period of time. So there'd be that steady progression that maybe we see happening a bit slower than we do now. I hope I made sense.
Thank you. Is there another question before my question and my comment? No, I don't think so. So maybe my comment is, you wrote law and technology evolve, but at different speed, and you said law is very often, let's say, behind. For me, one problem of the laws, especially at the European and American level, I don't know enough about South Africa, but at European and American level, is that they create such a complex situation that it is sometimes almost impossible to have progression of science. For me, the period of COVID was for this very, sadly, very interesting, because of privacy laws, because of IP laws, because of many aspects of legal aspects, the progress against the disease was really slow. That's my comment, but of course you can comment on my comment. And then my question is about there is in many European countries and also in other countries, but I don't know in South Africa, but the concept of duty to rescue. So the fact that when people are at risk, it is compulsory, legally compulsory in Belgium and France. If you don't help somebody who could die, you can be it's a criminal offense. Do you think that we could consider the, let's say, Science for Life extension as a duty for rescue at the level of scientists and also at the level of stakeholders, people deciding in the governments? Because you were saying at one moment, you were speaking about this very interesting case, but I suppose that the judge also take in consideration the advancement of science for this and not only the money aspects. This is for my comment and my question.
Thank you so much. So just for your comment first, I completely agree with you. So you were talking about the law being complicated and it creating a situation where progress is actually prevented or made slow because of the legal system. And I think the COVID pandemic has shown us that, because, this is the difficulty. Law and science, they're very far apart. And that's where my interest is. It's trying to bring the two of them together so that they can grow in a way that doesn't create the situation where we have a scientific development, but then we find that it's prohibited by all of the laws or that there's no laws, etc. And I think with the COVID pandemic, it sort of showed us and continues to show us how we can even create these opportunities for discussion in society. Because, one of the things you mentioned was the IP laws, the intellectual property laws. And this was a massive problem because intellectual property laws affected access to vaccines. It affected countries' ability to make vaccines and, protect the right to health of the people in those countries because of intellectual property laws. So while countries have the intellectual property laws, no one had actually thought about how those laws would relate to each other if there was a global emergency like a pandemic. And so now we've got the World Health Organization spearheading a pandemic treaty, which looks at how can countries work together, using a pandemic treaty as, a new international law. How can countries work together to actually protect the right to health? And I think what it's also shown is that this societal discussion, this public engagement about these important issues is important, because apart from the intellectual property law problems, what became a massive issue in countries is vaccine hesitancy. And that's because, excuse me, people were scared to take the vaccines. They were worried, how did you get this vaccine so quickly? What's in the vaccine, etc. So when we talk about ethical reflection, when we talk about having to discuss these issues and get some kind of community engagement, I think the COVID pandemic has shown us how important this is, because if you don't educate the public, if you don't engage with them on issues of concern to them, then this is a potential problem that can happen. You can have a problem where people are hesitant to actually access the treatment or use it. So I agree with you that, the law can complicate things, but I think the pandemic has provided a nice basis for us to understand how issues that can potentially affect everyone become global issues, how they can be addressed, and what are the things that we need to address, and when do we need to address them, and how we can work together. And again, you know, all of these issues has resulted in the basis for wanting to create an international law so that the laws can work better together and countries can work better together. The other issue you said was in relation to, or rather your question was in relation to the right to rescue or the right to treat. Yes, I do agree with you. So, you know, you must treat someone if you are able to. So a medical professional, if that person requires treatment, etc. Now, the case that I mentioned, you know, again, you know, I gave you a very superficial kind of look at it, but you know, what the patient said was that, you know, he required dialysis so badly that it actually was an emergency. And in law, you have a right to emergency treatment. And if it's a medical emergency, the law says you must treat that patient, you know, and that will apply to any medical discipline within reason, of course. So for instance, if you're in a car accident and you're taken to the hospital into casualty, you must be treated as an intervention that could potentially save the patient's life. So again, he argued this is a medical emergency. The law says I have a right to emergency medical treatment, and the hospital is just not giving it to me. And what did the court do? The court had to look at the situation and to determine whether this was emergency care. And the court said in his case, it actually wasn't. So again, yes, I agree with you completely. Emergency medical care, yes, the patient must be treated. The law will consider whether that is an actual emergency. You know, the one thing that I wanted to add on that I just thought about now, and it's something that we think about in the context of new technology. We've been thinking about it for quite a while in the context of genetic screening. If we think about not the interventions, but the medical screenings that are performed when a pregnant patient goes to her doctor, the maternal screenings that are performed. If we think about the state of technology now, we've moved beyond ultrasounds. We now have blood tests which are available that can diagnose genetic issues, genetic disease, for instance. We can now undertake genetic screening and genetic analysis at embryonic level, and all of this wasn't available back then. One of the questions that has arisen, it's quite an interesting one, is relates to that issue of equity and access, because that's one of the arguments. If you know the technology it's great technology, it has the potential to make us healthier, to remove disease from our family trees. It will have the potential to prolong life, but who is going to access that technology? It's going to be people who can afford it, because we see gene therapy being very expensive now. The other side of the coin is when we find the technology widely available, if it is broadened, if access is broadened, what happens in a situation where a patient wants to refuse treatment, where a patient wants to refuse intervention? Would society consider that that's morally wrong or ethically wrong if you can enhance your children, for instance, or enhance your own genome and you choose not to do it? Why wouldn't you do it? Could this become a new standard of care, that not only do we screen for disease when people go for fertility treatment, but you know, CRISPR technology becoming widely available, must patients use it? So standard of care in the future, I think, is also a very interesting prospect, and how standard of care may evolve. And again, that societal discussion is incredibly important. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I would like to answer and to comment, but no, I will not do it because I'm only here for the animation. And yeah, we are. I was kind of afraid that this meeting, this conference would be too short, and it's going to be almost too long because of your great interventions. The first two speakers, and now we are coming to the third. Bernard Barchi is a senior researcher and teaching, well, and was teaching, he's not anymore, professor at the University of Geneva, Institut Éthique, Histoire et Humanité, member of the Ethics Committee of INSERM in France. He's currently working on fundamental ethics, bioethics, and neuroethics. And for the three speakers, I forgot to mention probably the most important aspect, the most important organization where you are working in the most important organization in the context of this conference. It's ARICH, Association for Responsible Research and Innovation in Genome Editing. Yeah, now, Bernard, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Didier, for the invitation. I will share my screen. I hope that everything will. Okay, do you see my presentation?
Perfect.
Yes.
And full screen, yes.
The slide is not new, as you already know, because the presentations of Sheetal and Hervé has already stated this 13 article of Oviedo Convention. So as you already know, this article only authorizes somatic gene therapy, since it prohibits germline therapy and any non-therapeutic intervention, somatic or germline. This sort of intervention concerns, for example, genetic doping or garage genetics practiced on oneself. So, normative prohibition, be it legal or ethical, must be justified. Indeed, in a liberal regime, freedom is presumed and individual liberties cannot be limited without good reasons. There exist two different kinds of those reasons. Reasons related to risk, that is to the probability of harm. We can call them prudential reasons, and reasons of principle. The difference between the two, between both, is that risk-related reasons are rebuttable and therefore generally temporary. As soon as the risk disappears, the prohibition falls. Principal reasons, on the other hand, are definitive and permanent. What are then the reasons alleged by the Oviedo Convention? To find out, we have to read the explanatory report, a long document that you can download on the same website. But before examining this report, I would like to highlight two normative phenomena that are important to keep in mind in this area. These two phenomena are the Ulysses approach to normativity, and the second, the prudential disguise. It is not uncommon for normative texts to insist on reasons of principles in the belief that they provide better protection against the consequences one seeks to avoid. This is what might be called an Ulyssian approach to the norm, quite common among Kantians and deontologists. Indeed, we recall that Ulysses, in order to listen to the siren song without risking to rush into the sea, had himself tied to the mast of his ship and had his companions' hair filled with wax. Thus, when he begs them to untie him, they do not hear him, which allows him to survive the adventure. The Ellisian approach considers moral and legal principles are Odysseus bonds. They prohibit preventively for fear of serious consequences and refuse any weighing of interests. Psychologically, I think this denotes a kind of lack of confidence in our ability to manage risks, in a kind of moral panic, according to the expression put into circulation by Reuven-Ogien. Panic, as we know, tends to elicit disproportionate responses. That is my comment of this approach. The second phenomenon is a prudential disguise. It often happens in debates on biotechnologies that when a risk is removed, another one arises at the very same moment. And this is repeated indefinitely, with the feared damage becoming less and less plausible. This was notably the case for vaccines and is very much present in the discussion on GMOs. One realizes that those who are opposed in principle to a biotechnology, for example, to genome editing, tend to multiply the risk in order to block it, a strategy that is not always conscious on their part. In this case, arguments of prudence mask arguments of principle. One alleges the risks while being opposed to the practice itself. This is what I call prudential disguise. That this should be so is not surprising, for no one denies the relevance of prudence. So this is the point of which everyone is sure to agree, but it does not contribute to the clarity of debate. Indeed, instead of having substantive discussions, we fall back on quarrels between experts, each one alleging his own, with pseudo questions of fact, replacing questions of ethics or even of worldview. The discussion can then go on as long as one wants. One way of knowing whether we are in a situation of prudential disguise is to ask the following question: what would count as sufficient safety? If there is no reasonable answer to this question, then we are in a situation of prudential disguise. Now, let us turn to the explanatory report. I have made some extracts of this report. This report begins by recalling that the only acceptable purpose for modifying the genome is medical. I quote, "In every case, any intervention which aims to modify the human genome must be carried out for preventive, diagnostic, or therapeutic purposes." It then recalls that this goal can only be pursued for somatic interventions, the field of research not being affected. Intervention, I quote, aimed at modifying genetic characteristics not related to a disease or to an ailment are prohibited. Interventions seeking to introduce any modification in the genome of any descendant are prohibited. Consequently, in particular, genetic modifications of spermatozoa or ova for fertilization are not allowed. Medical research aiming to introduce genetic modifications in spermatozoa or ova, which are not for procuration, is only permissible if carried out in vitro with the approval of the appropriate ethical or regulatory body. It should be noted that there is no question of research on embryos, but on gametes. This is because the questions of embryos is politically and ethically sensitive. Indeed, we read further on, the article does not take a stand on the admissibility of the principle of research on in vitro embryos. However, paragraph 2 of the article prohibits the creation of human embryos with the aim to carry out research on them. And this is the reason why Germany or Poland has not wanted to sign the convention, because these two countries thought that the convention was too permissive concerning embryos. That said, the report points out that significant medical benefits can be expected from genetic interactions. I quote, "Many of the current achievements and forthcoming advances are based on genetics. Progress in knowledge of the genome is producing more ways of influencing and acting on it. This knowledge already enables considerable progress to take place in the diagnosis and sometimes in the prevention of an increasing number of diseases. There are reasons to hope that this could also enable therapeutic progress to take place. However, the report continues, the risk associated with this growing area of expertise should not be ignored. It is no longer the individual or society that may be at risk, but the human species itself." Further on, we read that the ultimate fear is of international modification of the human genome so as to produce individuals or entire groups endowed with particular characteristics and required qualities. This calls for some comments. The first is that if we are talking about risk here, it is not from the point of view of weighing up the risk and benefits. This term designates a consequence that we are trying to avoid at all costs. That is, an impact on the human species. However, it is not easy to know exactly what this means. Of course, one could imagine transforming the entire human species, but it is not realistic, and also raise the question of how this would be harmful. Indeed, if one seeks to preserve the human species and to ensure its integrity, it is because one thinks that it contains something particularly precious. But what is it? Certain phenotypic qualities, no doubt. But when we think of some of them that are generally valued, rationality, free will, empathy, and so on, we see that the change of species could just as well improve them, as the passage from Australopithecus to primitive man probably allowed. If we think of genetically modifying individuals to make them beings of a different nature, that is not very realistic either. Lulu and Nana, the two Chinese girls, have been genetically modified, but this has not changed their humanity in any way. At worst, it will cause them damage, but it is damage to human individuals, not to the human species. In my opinion, the weakness of the objection indicates to me a certain moral panic. The report mentions yet another risk, manifested precisely by a fear to produce individuals or entire groups endowed with particular characteristics and required qualities. Here, we are no longer talking about the human species, but about individuals or groups that have acquired new qualities. But how does such general statements highlight a problem? Why should we be afraid, for example, that more empathetic individuals will be created? But perhaps the author of the report are thinking about the qualities that our ultra-competitive society values and the social pressure that their pursuit creates, as well as the possible inequalities that might result if genetic enhancement were to become effective. Unlike the first, this last objection is not irrelevant, but it does not seem sufficient to justify a prohibition in principle. It can be taken into account in a weighing of goods in a risk-benefit analysis. Such an analysis can take two forms. the precautionary principle approach and the risk-benefit assessment approach. The first approach, on the left, has some analogy with the Ulysses attitude. The precautionary principle focuses on the negative aspect, that of the harm, writes the Swiss Committee on Biotechnologies. The aim is to avoid risk and damage, particularly if they are serious and of low probability. That is, if we are in a context of uncertainty. And these damages are taken out of the harm-benefit weighing, playing the role of vetoes. For such risk, the precautionary principle approach is often justified. As long as we are in the precautionary arena, continues the Swiss Committee, it is not a matter of weighing up or balancing risk and opportunities, but of identifying the unknown probabilities of potential serious harm. The precautionary principle is not, as often claimed in discussion on the innovation principle, a principle that is sometimes opposed to the precautionary principle. It is not a principle for evaluating risk in relation to opportunities, but rather a principle for dealing with situations of uncertainty. However, with genetic interventions, we are not in this situation at all. The severity of the damage is itself questionable and its probability close to zero, especially for the impact on the human species. Thus, wanting to ban germline editing in the name of the precautionary principle could also be the effect of certain moral panic. However, the risk for individuals whose genome is edited has to be generally reduced. This is exactly what the academies of science of the different European countries have requested. The HESAC, that is European Academy Science Advisory Council report, says in particular, intensive research is needed and should proceed subject to appropriate legal and ethical rules and oversight. If in the process of research, early human embryo or germline cells undergo genome editing, the modified cells should not be used to establish a pregnancy. This approach to research, as for the application of germline intervention to human beings, the report says, it would be irresponsible to proceed unless and until the relevant scientific, ethical, safety, and efficacy issues have been resolved, and there is broad social consensus. Societal consensus. This is indeed an approach based on the weighing of goods and the mitigation of risk, and in my opinion, it is the right approach. But I'm not completely sure that it is the approach favorized by the Oviedo Convention. So in conclusion, if we applied all this to the case on longevity, what about longevity? To increase it significantly and definitively, germline intervention will be necessary, which the Oviedo Convention prohibits. But be careful, it does not prohibit the downloading of the mind onto a computer medium, a dream of some transhumanists, and the only process that would free us from the torments of death. On this point, on the point of genetic interventions, the Oviedo Convention participates in what Steven Pinker has called an obstructionist bioethics. It categorically prohibits, well, even as Hervé Chital has said, in the discussions around this convention, the opinions were not unanimous, and some dissenting voices have been made. But if we read the text of the Oviedo Convention, those dissenting voices are being muted. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bernard. So the only sad thing of this conference is that Hervé had already to leave, so because I would be really curious to know where you disagree and where you agree. But okay, now maybe who wants to ask questions or to make remarks before I do, if nobody is wanting to make remarks. Nobody, please. Okay, so Bernard, I really like your intervention. I agree with many things. Maybe some kind of remark about the word precautionary. The precautionary principle, at least in the where it's born, so concerning environment, is not always stopping things, but also doing things. So sometimes actually you can apply the precautionary principle a little bit like this, taking risk and advantages. So I'm just to say precautionary principle, like it is in the environment law, it's not stopping everything. And that's a more comment than a question. Maybe one question is, you quoted this, I don't know anymore which academies, but it would be irresponsible and to proceed unless and until the relevant scientific, ethical, safety, and efficacy issues have been resolved and there is broad societal consensus. But sometimes I have the impression that actually even these academies, they don't want to, let's say, to touch genes as long as we are not absolutely sure of the results. And by definition, when we are doing science, we are never absolutely sure of the results. Do you think that I'm too pessimistic or not?
Well, just an observation concerning the precaution approach. Of course, the principle of precaution principle has been used in the environmental domain, but in Switzerland, at least, when we have discussed the problem of GMOs, because as you know, in Switzerland we vote on this question. In the debates before the votation, a lot of people who were opposing the use of genetic manipulation, as we said, were give as reasons an approach based on precaution of prudential. So it's not exactly the precautionary principle, but it has one point in common, that is, some risks are too big to be risked. Of course, they play the role of vetoes. That is, in my opinion, a view that is opposed to the risk-benefit analysis, even if we can, I know it combines the two, both. So concerning the academies, well, they have adopted a defensive stance because they have been accused of eugenicism and so on, and in response, in reply, they have decided to be very cautious. So I know personally a lot of scientists that are, well, very favorable to genome editing, but in official documents, they have to be more moderate, if I can say, because if you know, scientists have lived a very bad trip with the debate in the 40 years ago in the debate concerning genetic manipulations, and they don't want that the same situation comes again. So they have to be careful, because there exist a lot of activists that use, as we say in French, peigne le diable sur la muraille. That is in English, I don't know how to say it, but they insist on risk, big risk, maybe realistic or not. And in this context, they have to adopt a defensive stance. So, in my opinion, there is the problem is not with scientists; it's with the politicians and the society in general. We should have an organized debates on these topics. Debates are already organized, but it should multiply them in order to show that if that is completely right, there exists some risk, we have to underline, to highlight the potential benefits of these biotechnologies. So you can be a little more optimistic than you are.
Okay, thank you. So, is there somebody wanting to ask a question? No, if there is, take the word and don't forget to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Okay, maybe not really a question, but I do agree with one part. I think there is a little bit of a gap between the political side and the research side. When you have the research side, you have the scientists. The scientists, they don't think in facts. For a scientist, you have a theory, you have everything. It's something that may or may not. And I think when the political side take the research into consideration, they tend to be very confused, because they will say the scientists are not sure. But I think there is a time where something like a theory, when you have like the level of confidence is beyond 90 or 95%, then at that time you can consider it as a fact. A scientist would not consider that as a fact, but from the political side, they should consider that as a fact. So I think there are many potential therapies, treatments, whether, not only in regard to gene editing, but yes, also in gene editing, where the reward outweighs the risks. And the person who has only a few years to live, or who has a progressive degenerative disease, which is incurable, ALS and so on, they only stand to benefit. And all this bureaucracy, all this uncertainty that the political side, because the political side, they cannot really, I don't think they can understand very well the science, or they can understand the scientists very well, because for them, the scientists are never sure about anything. The scientists are not even sure if smoking kills, because in a research paper, you could never state it as a fact. That wouldn't be scientific. So you have to say smoking may kill, and then you have good evidence. So I think maybe one good way to help would be something to have like a mediator between the science and the political side, and to transform at least the high confidence information into a fact that can be used in the policies around the world, and to help bring treatments to the people who can really benefit. And I think like that would be a good start. What do you think about that?
Yes, you're completely right. Politicians are not scientists in general. There are very few scientists that make politics. I don't know in England or in the US, but in Switzerland or in France, this is a big problem. And sometimes they even don't want to hear something like genetic, because genetic for them is the devil. You know? So the situation is difficult. And in a sense, you're right. Politicians have been upset by the debates and the discussion between scientists, because traditionally they thought that science is the truth. They have not read Karl Popper, and they don't know what is falsification and so on. So they don't know. It's not well. Every one of us is very ignorant of a lot of things, and the politicians often are lawyers, or they are teachers, or they are professional politicians, and so on. They have not benefited from a good scientific education. So, as you say, we have to be mediators between scientists and politicians to try to if we want to reap the benefits of the biotechnologies.
Thank you, Bernard. So this was great. If there are no more questions, I propose to stop here after, I would say, one or two, or maximum 1 minute of conclusion from Sheetal and, well, first from Bernard, then last but not least, Sheetal. Yeah. If especially if there is something you wanted to say, you forgot, or a sentence of conclusion. So Bernard first.
Well, I've just spoken a lot now, so I have nothing to add.
Okay. And now Sheetal.
His microphone is closed.
Yeah, Sheetal, you muted, or maybe she's not. She's just not here at the moment. Okay, so yeah. So thank you very much for this. So it will be online soon, and I hope that we will have many discussions later on these fascinating questions, but and really, like each time when I'm listening to you, I learn quite a few things in this domain. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Goodbye, everybody.
Yeah, no, just informal. If you have something to say that you did. You want to say, not record it, it's the moment. Makiko, especially, because I know that you were coming for this to see. Yeah. But,
hello.
Yeah, hello, Makiko.
Thank
Hello,
you for
Makiko.
this opportunity. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there from 5 o'clock.
Yeah.
I'm very interested in this topic because of my thesis that I'm going to start from this September. So I'm very happy to be able to listen to you. So thank you so much.
Okay. Okay. Hello, Agdolad. You arrived at the end. Sorry about that. Okay.
Happy to be here. Happy to attend the meeting.
Yeah. For you will be able to see it online. Okay. 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 So now I will. Close the Zoom and yeah, goodbye to all. Au revoir aux francophones. Salut.
Au revoir tout le monde.
Thank you.